Welcome to RPG Reanimators, a podcast for GMs where we dissect horror scenarios and offer our experiences and advice to reanimate them at the table. I'm Nathan.
I'm Alex.
I'm Holly.
And I'm Lex.
So let's see who's in the waiting room. Today we're consulting on an acute case of props and handouts for your tabletop RPGs. We'll discuss lessons we've learned from our games and offer our best advice on how to try making them work at your table. Now, let's begin our consultation. All right, I want to get us started right now.
Okay.
What is a handout? What is a prop? I need very narrow definitions of these things.
What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen sparrow?
To me, a handout is like a device or a document or anything that you can hand to your players to convey information.
Yeah, something that furthers the narrative. And to build on that, like a prop is more of an object that doesn't necessarily, further the narrative, but is something that kind of the players can hold in their hands and it ties them to the story. It's just something nice to have.
Yeah, it increases the believability.
Immersion.
Whereas a handout, right, can be a way for it's a vehicle for information. So information including a map or like a note or like a ritual. There's a lot that you can do with handouts.
I would consider props as typically objects, images, or cool sound effects that serve to increase immersion from players with a game, versus handouts are physical clues that you are spotlighting are important and further the narrative or investigation. In a case of a game like Convergence, there is a certain thing that I would call an audio prop. It really doesn't do anything to further the story, but it's creepy as hell and gets your players very invested.
I like that. So a handout could even be something like, I know Thomas, he's run some games, he's actually molded clay with clues in them, like like little statues. That would still be a handout because it has game relevant information on
Absolutely. Props to Thomas G for his props.
Hey, props.
Hey.
Got him.
So that's the definition we'll be going with, I suppose. And now I'm going to ask, what about miniatures? Are miniatures props?
Sure, if you want.
This is a D&D podcast now. You're
Oh
welcome.
boy.
To me, I don't know. To me, that's a prop, right? Like it's a frame of reference, especially if we're talking D&D or any like battle map type of game where you're using miniatures to kind of denote where people are in relation to other things.
Yeah,
I don't know. That's still a prop
Yeah,
to me,
that makes
like in a
sense.
good way, but it's more providing a frame of reference than anything else.
Yeah, I mean that like ties into mechanics.
Yeah, and like thinking whenever
Mhm.
you have a GM that slams down this giant ogre piece that is larger than any of the characters' ones, like that is a prop to have your characters give a bigger reaction for that in-person perspective.
That's the house cat on the table.
I love it. So I know most of the stuff we do is online. What are the differences that you find between in-person versus digital?
Well, digital, you're completely missing a lot of senses, right? You can't touch the prop because you can't, unless you like mail it to them and tell them to open the box whenever it's time. You can't smell, you can't taste. You can hear it, right? And you can see it.
In my experience, well, one, I'm generally too lazy to make physical props. Like, I've tried writing out paper. I did the grade school thing of crumpling it up and spilling tea on it and all that stuff to make it look old. That's just a lot of hassle for me. In terms of digital props, though, I found that it was a bit of an uphill climb for a bit until I just have a folder saved with a bunch of paper templates and a bunch of fonts, and generally getting a system set up using like PowerPoint or Photoshop if I'm feeling fancy to create image-based props. So now I can whip them up pretty quickly, sometimes mid-session. And also, I mean, getting involved with the podcast is just once you get kind of familiar with Audacity, it can be super easy to make good audio props that I find really increase that player immersion.
That's right. And I think another digital benefit is that it's super easy to disseminate. You just drag the file to whatever
Yeah.
Discord server or chat you're in,
Yeah.
and then like everyone has it right away. No one has to pass it around physically. However, there is a point where when you're in the meat space here and you have a physical prop,
Hate the meat space.
there's a joy in turning the prop and opening it up and actually fiddling with it, which you don't get on digital mediums.
And breaking it by accident.
There's also that anticipation too of like you get a note and someone's reading the newspaper and everyone's like, what does it say?
What does it say? What does it say?
We're like reading over someone's shoulder. I did that for the Blade Runner one.
To piggyback on Nathan's point, I think in my experience, making physical props and handouts does take a bit more work, and then it is a little annoying or upsetting when you watch that one player who, like me, fidgets and can't sit still, and then all of a sudden your beautifully constructed letter is just like in shambles and crumbled up, and you're like, no, I spent so much time on that.
That's unlucky.
So what I really heard from Lex there is get an art degree or start a podcast.
Or have money.
Or have money
to pay someone.
Lots of money if you're doing Photoshop.
And this is also one I might come under fire for, but honestly, AI has been really handy just if you need some kind of room setting stuff.
Canceled.
Oh, no.
Out. Get out.
Well, I mean, I feel like it's fine as long as you're not trying to sell
not
other
profiting.
things.
Yeah, like I'm not putting it in scenarios. It's just, oh shit, I need a zoom background for the like impossible landscape. So I just run through a bunch of AI stuff to make something just easy for a local game.
Well, the nice thing too is, especially the more you get into the hobby, the more you start meeting artists and stuff. And that's a good point of if you are looking to publish or if you want really like nice custom things, artists are usually a lot cheaper than you think they will be.
Pay your artists.
Yes.
I'll say it louder for the people in the back. Pay your artists.
And I don't know, have we tried making like audio handouts and stuff with AI?
No.
Anybody
No,
done
no,
that?
I haven't
Yeah.
used
Is
AI.
it there
Personally,
yet?
I just grab a friend. I say, hey, can you recite this line? And they're like, sure, that sounds a lot of fun. I remember making a couple audio handouts for one of my mothership games that I believe Lex and Nathan voiced. And then I added
and I
some
was wondering why you want me
explosions.
to chant so much.
You were the perfect person to be a hoity-toity administrator.
The shitty HR person everyone hated. Yeah,
Yes.
it's truly my calling.
So, what do you look for in your handouts? What do you minimally want them to accomplish?
Readability is the first one for me. No, I like, and you laugh, but I have had handouts from published scenarios, and I'm like, what the fuck does this say?
Looking at you, Masks of Nyarlathotep.
Really old, I mean, like cursive. Like I can read cursive, but then it's a combination of like cursive and then like a stained paper, and it's like, oh my god, I can't read this.
I believe RPG Writer Workshop, when it's training writers to write scenarios, it recommends that they include like a text description of the handout and the handwriting in text format, which is super accessible, and I'm all for it.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I try to include plain text of any of the handouts that I make for games, just because few things are more frustrating for me than getting a cramped PNG in cursive that I can't read. So it gets pixelated by the time I look at it, and then I have to manually write or type everything out because I'm not going to reread this later on. Whenever I'm looking at including handouts is or a reason that I really like including them is they are good spotlights to give to players to show, one, that they are on the right track or something interesting is nearby. Two, this information is probably important, especially where a lot of my games online are subject to extended delays or breaks between sessions. In Music from a Darkened Room, we went a couple of months between game sessions, but where I made a handout of a certain book that was found, that was the first thing that players looked up and reread, so it was a very quick way for them to orient themselves in starting the game again. So that's something, especially with Delta Green, if there is a file or some kind of information that I think will be helpful for them to refer back to, I try to include that as a handout, as kind of my first level bullet point criteria.
I'm looking for, does it make sense in the world?
Hmm.
Like, if this is a cyberpunk world, I would expect a text log instead of writing on a piece of paper. I would expect maybe a voice recording.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in a 1920s game, you really wouldn't expect a voice recording at all, unless there was the wax cylinders and whatnot. So verisimilitude, that's what I'm looking for. Also, there's definitely a chance that people might get analysis paralysis if there's just way too much information in a handout.
Yeah.
So I like my handouts to be easily digestible, but that's my personal preference.
That's a good point. Open question for the group. What would you say would be kind of a roundabout number for a number of handouts per session, or maybe per scenario, to try to avoid that information overload?
I don't know if I can put a number on it barely because it really depends on the scenario. I would say like if you get like an entire page of text, that can be a little overwhelming.
Yeah, I mostly asked this because I did feel just completely swamped in Masks of Nyarlathotep when we just get these files and it's loads of papers. And I'm like, well, okay, let's just call it here because I'm going to need the rest of the night to read all of these.
Right.
I really think like I might aim for 3 kind of short 1 or 2 paragraph level information per session, maybe, but that's kind of pushing it for me.
Yeah, I'm with Alex. I don't set a number to it, but I do keep an eye out for, especially in campaigns. Am I really like repeating the same information multiple times in multiple handouts? And if so, like, does that really
Right.
need to be disseminated to people if they're just getting the same information? And also being mindful of bad red herrings or things that will set your players, like vector them down a completely wrong path that's just going to derail anything. Like, I know that sometimes, as writers, we try to be a little clever and like, ooh, they'll try to do this and get surprised or whatever, and then it's, no plan survives first contact. Not what they say. It's just going to end up in disaster. So being mindful of red herrings and things like that.
That's when they find a very hastily written second handout called How I Did It.
Yeah, for my perspective, it depends a lot on what you're going for because I've had some handouts where it's like a page and you go at the end of it, this could have been, a
Mm.
sentence. You could have pared it down a little bit. But I've also played in the one I'm looking at is a fantasy game where we get like 6 full on tablets full of text, but I didn't mind it because we spent a lot of time that first session looking at them, but they keep coming up, they keep being relevant. And if you give a handout that you use once, keep it short. But if it's something that you can find more information from, you can start going, they mentioned this emperor here, and now we're seeing something. Does this put it in a new light? That I find a little bit more palatable.
I don't want to set any like hard and fast rules, but like just as a
6 is too much. Gotcha.
just as a like rule of thumb, just pay attention to the theme and tone of your game. If it's a fantasy game, maybe keep it simpler. If it's a detective game, mystery game, maybe have them shift through a bunch of text to figure out the clues.
I don't know. I'm just trying to think in terms of my squirrel level attention span. That, like, you describing that handout, I'm like, nah,
Yeah.
I'm going to pass that to somebody else to read and give me the bullet notes.
I need to have Subway Surfers right next to me in order to read it.
There is a point to that though of you'd mentioned before, Alex, whether it fits in the world. I think of like House of Leaves, right? Where there is a lot of extra stuff in there, but the extra stuff is important because that's the feel of it, right?
Right.
It's really fluff. It's unnecessary, but
It's the vibes.
you need it there to get the vibe, right?
I think that kind of fluff, as you called it, can be an interesting second layer to add into things. Something that I really enjoy doing with handouts, if possible, is to include some like puzzles or anagrams, the classic stuff like the only words that are capitalized spell out something. I think that was actually one of the little points in House of Leaves where there's a big gibberish letter and you need to take down the capitalized letters.
Yep.
That, like, I think that can be fun, and
It's like a mini game.
Right. And I think for a way for those types of players that do enjoy that can have their fun, but other ones that are like, that's cool, bro. And then they can just get the answer from someone else later and not
Yeah.
potentially holding progress up based on can they solve this clue. I'm thinking of like, Saturnine Chalice, where you can do the fun puzzle thing, or you can just roll and move on with it.
I see a lot of this in my Pathfinder games too, because sometimes you just have a player who just wants to kill shit, and that's fine.
Mhm.
And sometimes that player is you. Oh, what?
Hey. Shh.
So now I want to bring up another controversial topic: journal entries.
Mm.
Those I find in games are very often there. They're very important as ways to give clues, and they seem so unfamiliar to the current day. Who's writing down the if I did, other than OJ? Who's writing down
Shit.
if I did it?
I agree. I think that that's very much a relic, pun not intended, of the kind of 1920s Call of Cthulhu era, when that is that way to preserve verisimilitude. Because, I mean, apparently everybody had a fucking diary back in the 20s and 30s, because that's what you find in every Call of Cthulhu scenario. Whenever you're thinking about preserving that verisimilitude in a modern day, though, I tend to think, would players be looking at old emails? Would they be looking
Hmm.
at voicemails or like a voice recorder that they can pick up in a certain creepy bathroom? And just finding what would be remnants of someone else's life that you could then conceivably pick up on.
Mm.
As an alternative, which may be a segue, what are your thoughts on, I'm going to call them summary handouts?
Hmm.
I made one for Music from a Darkened Room where players basically find a bunch of papers, and I just kind of gave a reading through it, you see this, and just giving some descriptive summaries that they could then refer back to because I hid some extra things in there, rather than trying to write out someone's diary, because again, I'm too lazy to do that.
I would say it depends how much you want to get into it, how much detail you want to put it. Because I remember in a Chaosium interview I was asked about environmental storytelling, because it's one thing like to narrate to the players that there was a struggle in the living room as the victim was dragged away into the basement. It's another thing to narrate that the sofa and coffee table are tossed aside and there's clutter everywhere. There's trail of blood and claw marks that lead all the way down to the darkened basement. Same exact thing, except that with the latter narration, players are coming to that conclusion themselves instead of being spoon fed it, which I think is a lot more engaging personally.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense for an investigation game where
Mm.
you expect players to put that together of why is this spot trashed? Why is this spot not trashed? Why is the shower running and this is trash? Oh, they probably caught them in the shower, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, start putting the clues together.
So yeah, I guess it's just how much effort you want to put into it, and if you know your players to be the type to enjoy the detail of investigating when you're creating this handout.
That's a
Because
good
like you
point.
could
Yeah.
say you're looking at this journal and it's showing that this man's mental state is deteriorating, or you can like babble on for 5 pages of insanity.
I think that can be a way to veil topics that we don't want to get into the nitty gritty
Hmm.
of necessarily in writing. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, God's Teeth does that, where it's like,
Yeah.
obviously, I'm not
Yes.
going to get into graphic description. Here's a very high level, like, this is your reaction. This is kind of the gist of what it
Right.
is that you see.
Yeah.
So sometimes, I mean, that's a very niche case, right? But sometimes it can be used to just veil topics that you really don't want to get graphic with in general.
I think with me, I also more prioritize, is this information that will be relevant and or brought up later? Because it can be something, if your players are barking up the wrong tree or seem to have lost the lead, you can redrop that handout or like ping it within the Discord server again and say, this catches your eye, look at it. Or potentially, like Alex had a great time in Blade Runner's Electric Dreams because the handout may have information for something later that you didn't catch at the time, but re-looking at the handout, it's like, son of a bitch, it was right there. So it can also be a fun reveal for players.
Kaiser Soze?
I would say that's more like an Easter egg.
Mm.
Yeah.
because like there's no like line you can draw with the current clues that you get at the beginning that like take you there immediately. It's just oh, look at that. That's really cool.
Mhm. I'm too lazy to do handouts like this, so I like a good summary, especially because then players can't tell when I'm just making something up because they've gone off the path and they go, "Well, what do I find here? You find a lot of accounting records that show that the store was sketchy." And I didn't just make that clue up. Eyes darting back and forth, back and forth.
Oh, honestly, that works though. Like you can either have a summary saying these accounting records lead you to this conclusion, or like show an accounting paper and then force them to do. I would not do that.
And that's something I will say, be very careful if you're going to aim for that true realism. In the case of Extremophilia, I got really excited because I made someone's death certificate because that is a key clue in part of the scenario, and gave it to the players. And they were like, what the fuck is this? Like, what do I know? Like, what do I know about this? And so not making any assumptions and at least having, I'm going to call it a plain text equivalent of those very in-depth handouts.
Yeah, you have to be careful about handouts that provide technical detail that like a player's character might know, but the player themselves don't really know what they're looking at. And I can definitely speak to experience with the scenario I had where I myself, as the keeper, had to call my friend who had a background in nuclear engineering to understand the handouts that were provided. And I'm like, I know my players aren't going to understand this. Can you help me understand this?
And they're like, no.
They were like, why are you calling me? What is this? And now when I call them, I'm like, this is for a game, right? Yes, for a game.
Hmm.
So let's talk a little bit. We talked a bit digitally how we make handouts. So, what kind of applications do you recommend that you've used before?
For anybody, I would say Audacity. I mean, it's free, it's open
Free.
source, I think. That and there are a lot of very easy tricks that you can do with the filter curve EQ to make your handout sound like a tinny speaker or a tape recorder or something like that. I had a lot of fun making tape recorder handouts in the past, and my players had very good reactions to it.
Yeah, and there's tons of copyright free like audio libraries that you can get like static, explosion, screaming, fire, whatever you need.
Oh yeah, I get all the sound effects for this show off of freesound.org.
Right.
You can just key in, is this Creative Commons, no attribution? Yes, and now I don't need to worry about getting letters or anything.
You just gotta download it and then drag it into the track.
Mm-hmm.
And thankfully, there are a lot of YouTube videos that are about 5 minutes long that explain what an EQ track is and how to add sound effects. So if you're dumb like me, even I can use Audacity a little.
I won't, but I can.
The audacity. So that's great for audio. I would also recommend for like a Photoshop equivalent, because not everyone has Photoshop money to shell out. I would recommend GIMP, which is New Image Manipulation Program, which is basically a free version of Photoshop. I know that Paint.net is also a great resource to make handouts, as well as the Libre Office, which is basically Microsoft Office but free. Like there's no issues with like getting a parchment background and then putting on a fancy font and writing what you need to write.
And even something that I do pretty often is I will just use PowerPoint or Google Slides if you don't have the Microsoft Office or whatever, lay your images on top of each other, find some transparent PNGs, and then take a screen cap of that slide that you're working on. Boom, you now have business cards or easy paper handouts that way. In terms of getting that parchment background, I know there are several websites that you can find. Again, attribution free, open usage, both like paper templates, but also I have become a big fan of collecting handwriting looking fonts to try and vary the handouts that people may find. One of my favorites that I recommend just for casual usage is called Rainy Beanie. I got tipped off to this from the Impossible Landscapes handler server, that it resembles very closely someone's handwriting that shows up in actual handouts in the scenario itself.
You could also just write on a piece of paper and then scan it in.
Mm-mm.
Like
Too much
there's
work.
a
Strongly
lot of ways.
disagree. You have not seen my handwriting. They would riot.
Also that.
Well, if you have neater handwriting, you could do that as an option. Like there's a lot of ways to do this.
So a child wrote this?
Just get your handwriting roasted by the players, and then you're like, "Man, who wrote this? A child?" And you're just crying behind the keeper screen.
There was a fun story about that. I think in Seth Skorkowski's review of A Mother's Love, that there is supposed to be a child's artwork that people can find as a prop in the scenario itself. And he drew that as an example of, well, like this is what a child's picture would look like. And then someone else said, actually, that's pretty good. Just use it.
Yeah, just utilize the kids in your life, folks. Like get them to write things. I do
No
have my
matter
niece
what
sometimes.
age.
She's 10. I'm like, here, write something down for me, or like draw this picture for me, and just easy cheesy.
So
Draw this
that's
slime monster with eyes and teeth eating this man, please. Thanks.
I'm 4.
Just do it, kid.
So how often do you remake handouts, especially for older scenarios?
Oh yeah, that's a great point.
All the time.
Yeah, if it's like a Call of Cthulhu, like 6th or 5th edition, most of these handouts are in black and white and the most like ugliest font, or no offense, but and like
Pixels
the maps
galore.
are all like hand drawn, which is neat, but it looks not what people are expecting nowadays.
Right.
So here's a question though. Do you use maps in your like Call of Cthulhu games?
Oh yeah, so I have an example. In Uncle Timothy's Will, there is a drawing of the layout of the manor, and it's just not good.
Mm-hmm.
Not good.
Yeah, Holly has a lot to speak on that.
Yeah, just not good.
Wise words.
Oh, okay.
No, it's just a nice way to put it. Like it's supposed to be this grand family mansion, and there's a total of like 5 rooms on this map, and it's small, it's difficult to read, and
What is
yeah,
this?
there's just not a lot of detail to it, you know?
Mhm.
No labeling, just very little detail.
You would do well to just like look up a blueprint of a fancy mansion,
Right.
and use
Or just
that.
use a clue board or something.
Right.
Or just theater of the mind it.
I'm going to complain about that though, because sometimes you want to look up Swedish mansions from 1850 and none of them show you what the second story looks like. And this is a big problem for all gamers everywhere that everyone shares. So I do agree though. The blueprints are the way to go. If you can find real life examples, that's best. But then I wouldn't draw the 5-meter grid or 1-meter grid on
I
it.
would avoid grids. Like
No grids. I think that if players, if the characters have knowledge of this space, it makes sense to give them a map, right? If it's relevant to need a map. But if they don't, if they've never been here before, I'm like, why give them a map in the first place? Because they're just going to be the locations are going to be revealed to them as they move through the space anyway.
So I think I may have misspoken actually, because I do fully agree that blueprints are really, really helpful handouts to provide, because I have found even whenever I have a very simple room plan, like it's literally a building with 3 rooms in it, my players would still get confused as, wait, which way is this door? And so like even just a very simple, shitty Microsoft Paint map to say like door, wall, door, window, dead body is perfectly fine just to help facilitate gameplay and like keep them in the moment and the session. What I was asking more as if you use maps, I mean like room maps with details, with the furniture and things. I know Cthulhu Architect has a ton of maps that people can use with VTTs and whatnot. And personally, I find these I would not use them because I would find them very limiting for improvisation. Because if someone says like, is there a lamp here? Be like, yeah. Oh, but it's not on the map. I don't care. And now you have just dismissed the whole point of having the map there.
all right, so I think I have 2 points. You can
You get
choose how
one.
much detail. All right, I'll
Put them together.
If your blueprint map is vague in detail, like it doesn't show furniture, that leaves room for improv, which I find effective. And I would also like some clarification on your like map question, because I understand there's like the top down, this is the layout of the building kind of prop or handout versus the like, this is a photo of the room handout like Blade Runner has.
I think that the photo of the room handout, or I kind of think of those either as handouts or props, really, as that's just more mood setting. But I don't expect players to use that to necessarily navigate like a fight scene within that room or whatnot. I think Blade Runner is kind of an exception to that rule.
What makes it an exception?
Well, right. That's the kind of the question is, if I was expecting someone to pick apart a room, that to me is just a more narrowed down blueprint, right? The blueprint is there to give you an idea of, hey, there's a silo in the backyard. So even if I, as the GM, don't mention that there's a silo that towers over everything, it's there.
Yeah, good point.
And for a room that might have, like, okay, this is the transformation chamber, here are the bookshelves, here are the lantern depots, as long as it's on the map, like, I don't need exact drawings of it, but just having something there to have a player say, "Wait, why is that say there's a dead body in the corner?" Crap! Right. Got so caught up in the lantern depot that I forgot to mention the guy you're looking for is dead in the corner. Roll sand.
I think mine is just residual scarring left over from too much D&D, and it's, oh, can I do this thing? Sorry, I didn't draw it on this dry erase marker map, so no, there isn't a tree to hide behind. And it's like, I just find it unfun and limiting a bit.
All right, let's talk about some more tricky things with props. We already talked about rooms limiting improvisation. How about portraits? Because that's something we see a lot in games is some characters have them, some don't.
I guess I'm just going to be the asshole that argues for AI this whole session, because especially with Delta Green games, I find this person does not exist to be a really helpful resource. I just have a folder where I was kind of clicking through random generation, getting some decent looking pictures and then saving them. So I will have that photo as a side in my notes, which just helps me kind of with role play cues. I don't need a lot of description based on that picture. I just kind of go from there. And I'll try to key them in for players during the session and say, this is this person, because it's a way for them to keep track of important characters. I'll usually make a separate channel just for NPCs, because that way it's a lot easier for them to keep track of who is who. But this is a massive double-edged sword in a game like Impossible Landscapes, where one, there are so many people, there are so many portraits, and not all of the important people have fucking portraits. So anytime you introduce someone that does not actually have an image, but all of these random side characters are, players are going to naturally assume, well, this person must not be important. But it's like, nah, that's just how it is.
I also find that Chaosium is a little guilty of making their evil NPCs just look evil in their portrait. Like, that's a bad guy right there.
Or like Ladybug, where the little kid looks evil as hell. But, you know, it's fine.
Yeah, so one thing I think that portraits take away is the image that your players create in their own heads.
Yeah, I agree that I don't bother giving players portraits almost ever because I don't care for the most part.
You heard it here. Nathan just doesn't care.
Yeah.
I don't use portraits, but I'm not good like Alex. I usually don't even describe the people. I'm like, hey, it's Jackson Elias.
It's the
there he
store
is.
clerk.
Yeah.
He's an old guy. There you go.
Yeah.
Mental image done.
Oh, are they Italian? It's a me, Jackson
Mamma
Elias.
Mamma mia, I've got so many cultists.
I think, Alex, you're good about describing NPCs. I've noticed that in your games. I should do that more than I do.
Do it. You heard it here, folks. It's live. A wager.
It's not live. This is edited, edited to hell.
Heavily edited.
It's live right now.
You're gonna like edit in, I'm a little bit of a freak.
So, how many handouts is too many? We've already kind of discussed that, but what, like, even with portraits, do you find that there hits this tipping point where it's just too much?
Oh, Holly's got big shaking head eyes. I think I've given way information overload.
As a player in Lex's Impossible Landscape games, there are a lot of faces to keep track of, and you're like, have I seen that person before? Do I recognize that?
And I
There's
think that's a
lot.
reason why I do try to make portraits for everyone, because there are so many names, and especially
Sure.
in a very complicated scenario, just looking at a bunch of names is not going to ring a lot of bells,
True.
especially if you're referring to people by nicknames or partial things.
Right.
And so being able to say they look like this, and then players can get it just helps them to keep track, I think.
But when is that important fluff, so to speak? Because sometimes for those games, the overwhelmingness is the point of having
Yeah.
so many random
Yeah.
clues.
I think some of it is like matching the vibe of the game that you're playing,
Mhm.
right? Like I think Lex, you've mentioned before that there's like lots of handouts and masks. And I'm assuming you're playing masks in the pulp game. So there's this kind of going in with this understanding of like high octane, lots of action, and then you bog your players down with a mountain of handouts and paperwork. You know, like this is what I signed up for.
I believe that's the critique classically of the Beyond the Mountains of Madness is the
Beyond the
first couple
manifests of
sessions.
madness.
Yeah, exactly. Those first couple sessions are, did you get an accounting degree? No? You should have. I'll chime in here of it's important when you're doing these handouts that you understand that sometimes props or handouts can vastly shift the tone from what players are expecting. Uh, the case might be you bring in a puppet professor when your players are perhaps intentionally expecting a kind of classic Call of Cthulhu going through this Arkham, university, and then the professor pops up. He's a puppet. That shift can be hopefully intentional and fun, but it can also really wreck it if people are really wanting that kind of slow burn and then a puppet shows up. They may not be able to make that shift.
That's a good point, but I do think that you sort of communicated that, like, this is just going to be a fun investigation. You were kind of bebopping
Mhm.
along in the beginning of it. That I think if it is possible to have that circumstance happen, but that is if you are deadly serious and intense and it's going to be blood and gore and it's Professor Diggleby. That is a hard left turn that may not pan out very well. But if it is like
Should have
expecting
done that.
your typical like Saturday evening criminal investigation CSI rerun, and then a puppet shows up, like, that's a little more fun. Because I think like with Diggleby, everyone's faces and there's a monster at the end of this scenario were just absolutely priceless whenever Professor Diggleby finally appeared on screen.
Yeah, and Diggleby is Nathan's puppet creation that he created
Other
for
self.
one of his
Yeah.
scenarios.
My true self.
Yeah.
Very effectively used. The kind of twist of him appearing was totally worth it and great.
And I think that you've done a good job keeping that manic energy up in terms of the sequel with the Great Innsmouth Caper, because now, of course, we are expecting some puppets, but then
Right.
bringing in something kind of new and different. That it's a very fun gimmick that you can bring in for a unique kind of game.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into props, right? Props are just something that add to the game,
Mhm.
makes it believable, helps the players visualize and get into the game. And what better way to do that than pulling out a puppet?
Yeah. And the key there that you mentioned, Lex, is I don't overdo it. And that is like front of mind whenever I bring out Professor Diggleby is I know he's a puppet, but that can't be the only joke in the case right here is if all I did was another puppet adventure, it'd be okay, but you can really wear out the welcome. It's like a joke you
Mm-hmm.
tell again and again and again. And that really works the same way I found for handouts is if I get the same thing again and again and again, after a while, it just gets to be like, I got it, man. Yep.
I think that's a huge reason why I don't really use journal handouts anymore, because just with Call of Cthulhu, I kind of have journal and diary fatigue.
If we're talking about like pitfalls and things to watch out for too, I would say with props, especially because it's like this object that people can hold, which they might assign as being significant since someone took the time to like bring this to the table. I would definitely limit props to like one or two things in a scenario that are actually like significant enough to warrant something that the players hold in their hands and look at. You don't want to give someone the literal red herring, like here's the fish. You don't, no point in it.
Well, Nathan, now you know you need to have a red herring puppet in your
To
next
be
scenario.
fair, I made a golden, what's the big mouth bass fella?
Oh, big mouth Billy Bass.
That was the MacGuffin of one of those.
Billy Bass.
Yeah. But that was intentionally not a red herring. It was actually important. So that's kind of a good segue to what makes it shine, right? Like, what makes the perfect handout for you? And I think we've discussed a bit about it needs to have meaning. If it's something big, it needs to have layers. It needs to be interesting enough that it stands out. What other things do you feel?
It needs to be creepy. It needs to, if you are reading an overview summary of something, it needs to leave the reader a little unsettled. It needs to let their imagination kind of go with what happened after this. Because we are largely playing investigative horror games, so I try to make my audio handouts a bit disturbing. I try to make any text ones leave maybe a little chill down your spine if I've done my job well.
I'm gonna counter argument. It doesn't need to be creepy. It just needs to convey the information. It just needs to. It's a vehicle for the information for the players, and I think that's that. It can be creepy if it
We're
is.
talking about making
horror
good
game.
handouts.
I don't know. There's still good handouts that aren't creepy. Like Blade Runner's handouts are good, but they're not creepy.
Well, it's not a creepy game. I'm thinking just more in terms of like Delta Green and Call of Cthulhu. Like that's that added spice that I try to put on them.
You're trying to flavor the handout.
Yeah,
for
I would say that makes for
going.
a better handout.
But not good.
We've seen your handouts, Lex.
Because like I'm just having trouble like thinking about how to make certain things creepy. Like a business card, you can't really make that creepy unless you like, I don't know, soak it in blood. But in that case, it becomes comedic.
It requires a lot of player buy-in. I'm thinking in particular of an experience we just had where we had a tiny koala figure on a finger where exactly it's a silly prop by its nature. But if your players buy in and work on it, you can make anything creepy.
You stash it under a pile of pancakes for someone to eat and comment on how delicious.
You can make it sinister. Sure.
Yeah, exactly. It takes a lot more legwork than a blood-soaked envelope or something.
Yeah.
And it requires the buy-in from your players, for sure.
Right.
That koala could have remained the goofiest fucking prop for the entire game that we played that in, but it didn't. Like, people bought in on, like, the hidden meaning to it, I guess. Speaking of hidden meanings, I do love a handout with, like, a little clue, a little, like, and it's not something that you have to get to forward the narrative along, but like it's kind of a reward for noticing something, like a little bit of extra piece of information or a little puzzle within.
Yeah, like Alex called them Easter eggs.
Yeah.
I think personally, for my definition of like a really great handout, is it has to be cool and like memorable.
I think that's where I've kind of settled into a rhythm with a lot of my big important handouts for a scenario. I try to have like one or two big handouts. And maybe it's a sign of me playing too much Elden Ring, but I've started getting in the habit of making them like From Software's item descriptions, where there is some kind of vague image and then you have your text description on the side. Often it's kind of just a summary that can give the essential information for this item that they picked up as kind of a halfway between a prop and a handout, because like I don't want to give them a book to read, but I'll tell them what is in the book. And usually I try to end it with some kind of a creepy-ish quote.
I absolutely love FromSoft. They have in their item descriptions, they have like a physical description in one part, and then the second part is like lore about the world that you couldn't possibly get from the item itself, but like it's still cool. And I think that's successful because it adds to the vibes, it adds to the tone of the game, which I think contributes to my own idea of a handout. Is it cool? Does it contribute to the vibe?
That's a fun
And
idea.
I also think that it contributes to that type of player's interest in the overall game. Like you're talking about with FromSoft, like it's very rarely essential to read through any of it, but it contains some kind of something interesting. So if you're the kind of player that's going to read it, you're getting a little treat. You're getting a reward for diving in a bit more that makes that universe more interesting and dynamic.
Yep, completely agree.
So would you put something for handouts? So let's use our journal entry as an example. Is you open the journal, you've got a little readout, and then you just add something physical like there are tear stains on the page that you can see, just little something
Oh, that'd be
extra
really
about it.
cool.
The edges of the diary are sharp,
Mm-hmm.
sharp enough to draw blood.
Or the book is hollowed out and there's an object inside. That'd be a cool handout. In one specific scenario, there's a description of a handout where there's a handout within the handout, like it's like within the page, and you have to like tear it open. I recreated that for my run of this
Nice.
scenario, and like that's memorable. That adds to the creepy vibes of the entire scenario.
See, you don't want to have a local group because then they start expecting that sort of thing.
You get
Yeah,
one.
my players eat good.
Just tearing up every handout you make, trying to make it something else.
They don't even
but
read
that
it.
was part of the Blade Runner box set, starter set. No!
Was I supposed to rip up the newspaper?
It's a little bit like escape rooms in that, right? Is you kind of need that person there that you can look to and be like, can I eat this? Can I? And so that they can give you the nod to be like, yes,
Yeah,
eat
you
the
can
cake.
eat it.
It was cake the whole time.
I mean, Alex was the one lamenting that you couldn't taste the handout. So yeah, I think
Right,
that this is a
that's
very
what I'm
valid
saying.
point.
Like, I think it's really cool to incorporate all five senses,
100%.
senses, because right, if you have a perfumed letter that only like one person uses a perfume on, your players might be able to pick that up. Right?
That'd be a good continuous like clue to players. That'd be cool.
Handout like arsenic candy as a handout. No,
Hey, this was poisoned.
Or is that a prop?
Yeah. It's definitely is something players will remember. So, what RPGs have you seen that have done this well? I think we've all talked about Blade Runner. Free League does this for a lot of their box sets, is they'll have pretty good visual handouts, if not like physical props.
Yeah, I think that Electric Dreams, frankly, is coasting off of the great quality of its handouts because they're really good. But whenever I was reading the scenario to prep it, I was just thinking without the handouts, it would actually be kind of hard to run. There are certain parts that just don't make sense. So this isn't going to turn to me just griping about it all night. But being able to have handouts could potentially overcome some potential gaps that like your players may be looking at the razzle dazzle, and if you're worried about something, just put that there. Also, I feel like we would be remiss if we did not once again praise Signal to Noise for Colin's awesome videotape handouts. Like, that's not something I'm even going to try to do, but super, super cool to have it in a scenario already done.
And it works great digitally or in person.
Absolutely. And just the delight from whenever you present players with an unconventional handout of any kind, just the delight on people's faces.
Shout out to Colin Richards, Signal to Noise. Now, like, that's a great handout, but also there's no need for that to be a video handout. But because it adds to the vibes and the cool factor, that's fantastic.
And he also gives summaries of the videos too. So like in the case of Nathan's intern that he wanted to keep rewatching them, it's just giving that PDF, and it contains kind of hints to the clues that are in those video handouts. So I just find like really nice tools for players all around.
Right. It just makes the scenario stand out.
And that was also Nathan just wanted to rewatch and figure those out. So yeah, having those
Nathan just wants to go crazy.
clues. Yeah, I just like rewatching weird stuff. Um, I think Yaziba's bed and breakfast. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it.
Hmm.
They had a tier where you could order basically an ephemera box to come along with it. And I want to say, didn't Alice is Missing do the same?
I'm not sure. I just have the basic version of Alice is Missing.
Yeah, they had some level where you could get basically vibe props,
Hmm.
which is very interesting if you have a local group that's into that sort of thing. They can, hold the little stuffed doll or whatever comes with it.
And then the stuffed doll talks, right?
Now that would be pretty dope.
I like to whisper in the dark.
That's true. You can buy haunted dolls for pretty cheap.
No, thank you.
Giving
All right.
spoilers for your next Diggleby scenario, I see.
You think Diggleby's not haunted?
How would Diggleby interact with Annabelle?
Not well for the players.
Oh,
So
that's always the case.
My next fan fiction, Diggleby Annabelle.
I really don't know why, but that Looney Tunes, hello my baby, hello my honey, is playing in my head nonstop now.
I'll have you know that Diggleby is happily married to a fish person.
Well, this is my coffee shop AU fan fiction, okay, Nathan? Everyone's just friends.
Some of our listeners are like, what the hell are they talking about?
Good.
Like the amount of like niche scenarios we get into is just like crazy.
But that's the joy of a good prop, right? Is it becomes something you talk about again afterwards. And
That's true.
it involves itself with stories. It doesn't just become, oh, you remember that cool, idol that they had? Yeah, sure. It becomes, do you remember that idol we had? And then Alex stabbed a guy with it. And you build up around it.
That sounds like 10 of our games.
I know, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
that's actually not very specific.
So if
Weirdly.
you want to get on the bandwagon and experience Professor Diggleby, there'll be a link to that.
That's a note for
Diggleby.
future, Lex. Lex gets it. All right. I think we've touched on a lot of these things. Are there any times you would just ditch a prop?
Oh yeah, if it's like way too convoluted and I'm running short on time, I'm just gonna axe it and give a summary.
With audio cue, I've talked with multiple people about like audio cues and ambient noise, and some folks it's too much. Like ambient noise becomes this thing that your
Yeah.
brain just doesn't pay any attention to at all. So then audio cues kind of just get lost as something insignificant. So yeah, I don't like audio. I don't like ambient music in my games because I find it personally distracting. But everybody's
Hard
different.
agree.
Now,
I
would you
can't.
consider ambient noise and soundtracks props?
That's a good question.
I know, that's why I asked it.
Probably not. I think that's just a mood setter. But
Mood setter,
specifically, if you're talking about like audio cues that are relevant, like a gunshot or
Mhm.
a baby crying or whatever, like it.
Oh yeah.
Maybe not a gunshot, but some of it can risk being like just blends into the ambient noise, and
Yeah.
then people totally miss whatever you're trying to get them to do.
You can definitely make those like soundboard sound effects very effective. There's a certain scene right at the beginning of Two-Head Serpent where a gunshot noise is perfect.
Right.
That when the guy gets shot?
Yeah, someone gets shot.
I guess in the case of digital props, then, I am a huge fan of using sound effects in a lot of my games. So the way that I have it organized in a folder is I'll have handouts and then sound effects. And I'll try to have either Zoom to share sound, or with certain bits of software, you can play the sound effects live.
Right. Lex does it so well.
Thank you.
I got goosebumps in Signal to Noise.
So yeah, I really like doing that because it is so much scarier to like be talking and then television static comes on behind you than for me to describe that happens. And so I'll often do it while players are kind of talking amongst themselves as this is something else that is happening around you. In the case of like music from a darkened room, having creaking wood sound effects or like doors knocking and handles being opened and whatnot, like they were really fun to bring in for additional sound effects because all the players will stop talking and be like, what the fuck was that? On the other hand, I do agree with Holly that I don't usually run like soundtracks or ambient noise to games because I do find that distracting. I know I tried to do something with a very, very low ambient noise in certain parts of Impossible Landscapes to indicate that something weird was afoot. But like honestly, I found that it overlapped with providing other sound effects and was just kind of, oh shit, yeah, I gotta turn that on. Sorry,
Yeah.
guys. And like, I just don't do
Yeah.
it.
Too much to juggle.
Yeah, it becomes something you have to keep up, which can actually complicate things a little further. Exactly to your point where you go at the end of a scene, oh no, that soundtrack should have been going the whole time.
Or like me and trying to play Blade Runner and it keeps going to fucking Frank Sinatra and I'm like, and it's in this great fuck.
Yeah, you can really imprint a Pavlovian response in your players if you start to use the same exact sound cues for certain scenes.
Yep. And that's exactly a reason why you might want to not do it. Same with battle maps we talked about. As soon as you lay out that grid, all of a sudden everybody's little mini snaps to that grid and they're going, I take 5 steps forward with my action economy. I open the room as an interact action. I hold, waiting for someone else's turn. It's like it's not that kind of game.
I feel like it can be a good and bad thing, right? So, like, one, you have this meta like knowledge where you see the grid and then you're like this, but also it'd be a great way to introduce like a unique mechanic where it's like, oh, if they
Mhm.
hear this wailing sound, they know that they're being hunted now. Like that, that's great. So there's cases for both.
Yeah, especially having like creatures that emit a certain sound. We played a recent game of 10 Candles where they would make a water dropping sound because I can't do that sound with my mouth. That was a nice non-verbal cue that something was out nearby.
Oh, and
so
that filled me with
Nice.
dread.
yeah.
Nice. So let's leapfrog off of there. We've already had a lot of war stories about handouts that have worked or haven't worked. I think mine is pretty limited to Diggleby because I can't be bothered. But what about you three?
I'll go. I play a lot in person with people, so I just like handouts you can kind of hold your hands on, put your hands on. I talked in our choice cuts episode that there was a scenario I ran Spilsbury number 9485. Sorry, I probably got that number wrong. It doesn't matter. But
Close enough.
in the narrative I kind of wanted to convey was that like this had been a persistent problem through time. So I told that with the story of like handouts through time. So it was like journal entries, love letters to someone dated in the 1800s, and then like technology progresses, and then it was a floppy disk, a literal floppy disk. And my player's like, "You shitting me right now?" But then I came out with a floppy disk reader. I'm like, "Never fear, you can actually use this." And then I had like a cassette with an audio recording from a friend of mine who speaks Mandarin, and she recorded this message in Mandarin. So, someone who could speak the language knew what it was. And then the final form of it all was a cell phone. And I actually took an old cell phone of mine and loaded up a bunch of information, text history, that kind of thing on it. Um, the kind of downside, I think I said this already, is that, if you kind of end up relaying the same information over and over again, like, is this really beneficial? And that's kind of what it was. It was like the same information and just highlighting that it was a persistent through time kind of problem. But I had fun doing it. But yeah, I like did all the coffee stain handouts and all of that too. So I had a good time. But yeah, it was a little repetitive in the end. So
I'm sorry, I'm still floored with the floppy disk story. Like, is that just the upper limit? What's next?
oh so I have this, I have it's an absolutely stupid idea and it'll probably never come to fruition. But if I ever want to just be absolutely insane, I would love to do an in-person game in which the handouts are digitized and the players, if a player looks at it and it's a language they can't read, right? So then it just looks like French to them. But then the player who speaks French, how can I get it to look like English? Of course, a sane person just says, let's make 2 handouts and give the person who speaks French the handout in a way they can understand. And it's like, no, we're going to digitize it and then give the players a bracelet with an RFID tag on it. And so when the right person is holding this digital handout, then it's in English and it looks like it, so they can actually read it. But the wrong person holds it in their hands, it's just in French. Will this ever come to fruition? Who knows? I might just take it as a personal challenge.
You got a few months before the next con, so
Yeah, you know.
I suspect we'll see that there.
That's, you're holding me accountable in a way I don't care for. Thank you. Let's not do that. on the negative side, since I'm just on a roll here, I created a handout for a game in which it was described that the person who, like, these journal entries or whatever, was sloppy, messy, just slovenly, and I found a messy handwriting free font. Guess what? No one could fucking read it because it was that bad. So lesson learned.
There's that fine line.
Yes, there's a fine line.
So this is not necessarily my worst story, but I still think it should be told. There is a unknown armies scenario where like one person has a gun and it's almost like a hostage situation and no one knows how many bullets are in the gun. So Matthew Sanderson, who runs this scenario, when he runs it live, he hands a cap gun to someone, the character with the gun, and like when they shoot someone, they actually have to pull the trigger.
What?
And if it doesn't fire, it doesn't fire in game.
That's crazy.
Yes,
Very cool.
and that is just an excellent use of a prop.
That is incredible.
Mm-hmm. I think I always really like the technology glitching and getting away from you in terms of livable horror in games. And I'm still really proud of a handout that I made, or prop handout, I don't know, that I made for my Impossible Landscape game after I had a player in session 1 upload the yellow sign to the internet on a message board asking, hey, anybody know what this is? And once they found out later, they were trying to delete it. And what I did was found an old, like, 1995 Internet Explorer kind of template website to get that feel to it, filled in the URL, and then gave a page could not be displayed error. So then narratively, they tried to delete it or hit like remove from page. And it gets this page could not be displayed error that says, okay. Then I said that they click it or they hit refresh and it boom, and I do it again and it says the same. Internet Explorer could not open the search page, but I changed one word in this kind of glitchy text. And then as they hit refresh or tried to exit out, boom, it does it again and more of the words are changed. And then I describe it starts refreshing on its own more and more until all the text is in this really kind of disturbing message. And just the player's reaction was damn good. Really, really one of my favorite moments so far.
Oh, it was incredible. I was a part of that. And I was like, what is happening? It was awesome.
Yeah, it was just making it on duplicated PowerPoint slides and then hitting Zoom share screen and hitting presentation immediately. So that I just kind of went through the PowerPoint presentation and narrated as it was moving from one slide to the next.
It's great. That's something you can only do digitally. Or, have a laptop at it.
Stand in front of a projector.
Game.
Okay,
Yeah.
now imagine.
That's true. I bet for the next con we could get one of those old projectors that you had in school with the little transparent things. I don't know how you'd use it, but
God, make it a horror game that you have to give a presentation on a topic you don't know.
Oh.
Now that is some modern day horror. We hope our deranged utterings are helpful in bringing this topic to life at your table. You can join the discussion on Discord and subscribe or follow the podcast to hear more gruesome consultations. Be sure to check out the show notes for links from the discussion, where to find us, and other links for things like handouts and other GM resources. We also post these to our Discord server. So until next time, thanks for listening to RPG Reanimators,
where your games can die.
Or live.
On the table.
I'm making everybody mugs that says I survived a handout that could have been a sentence because